sharpest VC on the cover of Business 2.0, and chosen by the SF Chronicle and SF Examiner as one of the 10 people expected to have the greatest impact on the Bay Area in the early part of the 21st century. Steve was chosen by Forbes and as one of tech's best venture investors, by the VC Journal as one of the most influential VCs, and by Fortune as their brain trust of top 10 minds. Steve was honored as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, as a distinguished alumnus by St. Mark's, and as Deloitte's Venture Capitalist of the Year for 2012. Wow. So everyone, please welcome Steve Jurvetson.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. She found the longest bio, I think, that's available anywhere online. And,
it's also good.
you know, of course, now that I'm introducing Ray, this raises the challenge because he's infinitely more interesting than I am, and how am I going to convey that in a punchy and short way? Ray and I have known each other for, gosh, almost 18 years probably now, and I've always been impressed by him. In fact, maybe the best testament I can give to how influential he has been is that one of his seminal slides, which I call the Law of Accelerating Return slide, or his version of Moore's Law, I show in every presentation I've ever given, regardless of subject matter, and it's always relevant, and it's always the most important slide I could possibly show, whether it's presenting to LPs or talking about any subject in technology or business. So, a lot of you know Ray, that's why you're here tonight. You know him as an inventor, a thinker, and of course a futurist. I'll read just a few quotes, not as many, because he's, of course, much more impressive. So, Wall Street Journal called him the relentless genius because of his invention record, right? So everything from, musicians might know, the first music synthesizer that could do the grand piano in kind of good fidelity, the first text-to-speech synthesizers, the first devices that could read books to the blind, the first variety of devices, frankly, flatbed scanners based on various kinds of sensors that were fairly accurate predictions of Moore's Law and where we would get. In fact, much of Ray's career is around predicting years in advance where we'll be, just based on the relentless march of progress and the accelerating rate of change. Some of the other accolades he received, Forbes calls him the ultimate thinking machine, which is pretty cool. And Inc. magazine, in terms of his entrepreneurial success, also called him the rightful heir to Thomas Edison. PBS, in a special, called him one of the 16 revolutionaries who made America. So he's also received a National Medal of Technology. He has 20 honorary doctorates, and he's currently Director of Engineering at Google, which of course proves that anyone doing anything cool ends up at Google. So, Ray, please. Is this a good place for him? Should we everybody can see him? Good.
And we will start the talk.
Fantastic. So,
I thought it was going to be 4 hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
There you go.
We'll see how it goes. Yeah, now we're going to do some Q&A and then try to leave more time for all of you. So start thinking about questions you might want to ask as we go along. To kick it off, I thought I might just read a small list, just one-liners, of predictions Ray has made most recently. So this is the last day of 2013. And one of the beautiful things about most of Ray's predictions, both in his books, which I highly recommend, as well as his thinking in general, is that he quantifies things. He doesn't just say, in the future there will be growth, right? The way maybe you see when thinking about predictions. So here are the predictions. 2017, self-driving cars. 2018, personal assistant search engines. 2020, switch off fat cells. Talk about that more later. 2023, a full immersion virtual reality experience. Full immersion. Really are there. 2030, vertical meat and vegetable farms. 2033, 100% of our energy comes from solar. And 2040, stay young forever. And only, again, at Google, because you work on artificial intelligence, immortality, the little problems, the little challenges. So before this event, actually asked some friends in the tech industry of those predictions, for example, what most interested them. Okay, so we'll perhaps start there. But this is all fodder if you want to ask about meat or anything. Maybe we can start with AI. And I'm curious, how do we get there? In the past, people would hear about AI and they'd be like, I don't get it. What gives us the hubris to think we can build something smarter than ourselves as an ultimate goal? And how do you envision that we get from here to there?
One step at a time. I think Watson was a significant milestone, and it's sometimes it's underestimated. I mean, people very often dismiss AI, saying, well, it can do these tasks, but they're very narrow tasks, playing chess, even driving a car. Jeopardy's not so narrow. It involves, first of all of human knowledge, but the interaction with the game is pretty subtle forms of language. And Turing identified expertise in language as requiring the full scope of human intelligence. So, and these queries can include puns, metaphors, riddles, jokes. For example, I got this query correct: a long, tiresome speech delivered by a frothy pie topping, and it was in the rhyme category. Watson very quickly responded, "What is a meringue harangue?" And, which is the correct answer. Pretty interesting. Jennings and the other guy, the best two players in the world, didn't get that. And what's not widely appreciated is Watson got his knowledge by basically sitting down, so to speak, and reading Wikipedia. It wasn't programmed with all of these facts by the engineers, and several other encyclopedias. And it doesn't read as well as you or I. It might read one page and say, oh, there's a 56% chance that Barack Obama is president of the United States. You might read that page and include this 98% chance, if you didn't happen to know that ahead of time. And so you did a better job of reading that page. Watson makes up for it by reading more pages, 200 million pages. I get stuck personally in 100 million. So that's what and it has a good Bayesian reasoning system, can combine all those inferences. Might read 100,000 pages about Barack Obama, conclude overall there's a 99.9% chance. Can do all of that in 3 seconds. That's a pretty good description, actually, what we're trying to do with Google. Do it at Google scale. There's some weaknesses of Watson. It doesn't actually understand verbs very well. So we're trying to do a better job, obviously, but it's a very good milestone, showing the beginning of a command of human language. And even if it's subhuman reading, computers can do things at these fantastic scales.
What was that breakthrough in that approach, the sheer scale of what it knows versus
you need to read
breakthrough in the process?
Well, the breakthrough is really to have enough traction in understanding each page so that the Bayesian reasoning scales up. If it was 50.3% chance, thought it was a 50.3% chance that Barack Obama was president, that probably wouldn't scale. So it has enough traction that with enough scale of reading, it actually can get up to very reliable insights on most everything.
So was the breakthrough linguistic parsing sufficient to trigger the Bayesian association engine, and then the whole thing can auto-catalytically learn off the internet?
Well, I mean, in my last book, How to Create a Mind, I talk about how I believe the human neocortex works, which is the region of the brain where we do our thinking. And I describe it as a hierarchy of modules, and each module can learn a pattern. And we create those patterns, and we create the hierarchy with our own thinking. And there's some parts of Watson that are like that. I mean, that's the basis on which we're creating artificial intelligence, at least my project at Google.
Tell us more about that. How does that work?
Well, I gave a copy of, I've had a series of conversations with Larry Page about AI, along the lines of commenting on Peter Norvig's, who's director of research. He wrote a paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Large Data. And so a lot of Google techniques have been fairly simple techniques, but when you apply Google scale data, you get interesting results. So it's a little bit different now, but the language translator used to work just by matching up word sequences, and they had these Rosetta Stone texts and translated text in pairs of languages. Vast amounts of those kinds of data. So for example, their English to Arabic and Arabic to English translator not only won the DARPA competition, but rated higher than human translators. Nobody on the team spoke a word of Arabic. Maybe it says something about the human translators. But so my pitch to Larry over the years when we've talked about this is the Google scale data is a necessary but not sufficient condition to really get human level AI. Let's actually base the techniques on models of how the human neocortex works. And then I gave him an early version of this book. It came out in late 2012. I gave it to him in the spring. He really liked it. I pitched him on an investment in a company I was going to start to develop those ideas because I'm a serial entrepreneur, because I pitched you on some deals. And he said, don't do that. Do it here at Google. We have these Google scale resources we've talked about, which, as you acknowledge, is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Actually, it wasn't this blunt. He's a very low-key guy, but that was his message.
Did you believe he had enough compute resources for your needs?
It's just barely enough. Actually, it's more than enough. I mean, I have a computation. I estimated 10 to the 14th to 10 to the 16th calculation per second in singularities in the year. Actually, it came out 10 to the 14th.
To be equivalent.
Yeah, but to be conservative, I said, well, let's say 10 to the 16th. In the new book, I have a different methodology, and it come out with 10 to the 14th. And Moravec also says 10 to the 14th. So, and Google has, maybe 100. Well, I can't say the exact amount. They have many thousands of times that level. So we have enough computation already. What we don't yet have is the software, but the software is getting better and more sophisticated, particularly as we're also making exponential gains in understanding the human brain. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is...
Before we get into, I want to hear that, to set this up, do you believe still that that will be how we instantiate the software, right? Getting better and better at brain scanning versus stopping, let's say, based on what we already know, and say, let's do something similar in silica and build from the ground up an evolved artifact in silica that is neural network-like, but not really directly an upload or a copy of the brain.
All of the above. I mean, the project I'm working on, we're using specific techniques which have been developed over decades on how to do things like co-reference resolution. So I saw Barack Obama, he is married to Michelle. Who is he? So that's a co-reference resolution. That's an easy one. Modeling what verbs are doing in a sentence, word sense disambiguation. I took my money and went to the bank. Did I go to a river bank? Or is it a financial bank? I mean, in fact, almost every word is very ambiguous. So we're actually compiling all of these best-of-breed techniques, and then we'll feed that into a hierarchical learning system that is modeled on how I believe the neocortex works. And I actually wrote a paper 50 years ago.
50s?
Yeah, when I was 14.
That was sort of sitting
That was
in this lifetime, in this universe, okay.
I think so. Is New York part of the And that was my Westinghouse Science Talent Search submission. I got to meet President Johnson. And it described how I thought the neocortex works. And it had the same thesis, that the neocortex is a series of modules. They're organized in a hierarchy. We create that hierarchy with our own thinking. And there was actually no neuroscience evidence at that time.
What made you have the...
Except for one piece, which is the common thinking then, and still common now, is that there's all these different regions and they must work very differently. Back here is V1 where the optic nerve spills into, and that detects primitive features of visual images. There's a straight line there, or the crossbar of capital A, and then there's fusiform gyrus up here, and that recognizes faces, and we know that because if you hit somebody right there, they will suddenly not recognize faces. And the frontal cortex, of course, is famous for art, poetry, and language, and they must work very differently. But there was one neuroscientist right around that time who did autopsies of the neocortex and said they all look exactly the same. They have the same neurons, the same connection pattern. He said neocortex is neocortex. And I based my thesis on that, and also observing what few human brains I was in contact with in action.
At 14, we're just not going to ask how that happens.
So human language is in fact a very good laboratory for studying the human brain.
Yeah, and much of your career, much of your work is worked around understanding language. So you, long before Jeff Hawkins or any of the sort of neo-generalists about associative memory, and that it's all the same, it's all big arrays of
Well, the hierarchical temporal memory that Hawkins wrote about, and it was influenced by George, who now has a new company, Vicarious Systems. It's quite interesting. It's a similar thesis to what I'm talking about. The key, and I actually talk about in the book how this model is actually similar to a technical area called hierarchical hidden Markov model, something I pioneered in the 1990s. But what we didn't do then, and what we're trying to do now, is to actually create the hierarchy from the machine's own experience and from the data. So in the neocortex, we create one level of abstractness at a time. So I've been watching my grandson, who's now 28 months, but the first couple of months he was laying down the first few layers, and they're dealing with primitive sounds and shapes and kind of almost random motions. And now at 28 months, he's mastered quite a few levels. And we lay down one level at a time.
Do you think we'll build AIs in an equally slow process?
Well, we can speed things up. I mean, Watson, read 200 million pages in a matter of a week or two.
Well, still got a week.
Yeah. So I mean, it takes us a month to read 200 million pages. So
if the way it experiences the world is purely virtual, meaning if it's an AI that interacts with information as opposed to trying to be anything else, right? So I wonder if in some of the roboticist paths to AI, I believe that you need to instantiate in a physical form that is 3D.
I actually go along with Turing that language is sufficient. I think you can actually read and learn everything you need to know. At least that's one path. Our experience in the physical world teaches us something too, but I actually don't think it's necessary. And Turing based his eponymous test, the Turing test, on basically a game involving text instant messaging. And if, in fact, an AI can convince a human judge that it's indistinguishable from an actual human foil, just with these text messages, then they pass the Turing test. And his contention was that you can't do that with sort of simple natural language processing tricks. You would actually need the full scope of human intelligence to do that. And in fact, you can get that level of intelligence by reading. There's enough, certainly we have tens of billions of pages at Google, and there's a lot to learn there.
At what point, if ever, do you think the AI is capable of improving itself on a time scale of, let's say, less than weeks, or a comparable time scale as if you think these things can be pulled together in weeks? Because the coding, the effort, the developmental, the body of knowledge that led up to Watson being able to read all those books and all that text in such a short period of time was a long period of time.
Well, if you read all those books, and that can include its own design documents, so we'll understand it. Designs are not actually that complex. If you were to write down all the formulas of Watson, it would be a small book. And so certainly an AI that can read at human levels, but at this fantastic scale, would be able to understand its own design, and then it would be able to improve it. So that's one approach to understanding the term singularity, that it's an intelligence explosion because it would keep improving its own design. It has access to its own source code. The iterative design loop gets faster and faster. So that's kind of a 2040 scenario.
Do you see this as a branch from all the other activities that are going on, being machine learning, let's say within Google? To me, from the outside, it appears that it stripes across just about everything interesting in the Google X projects, to autonomous cars, to you name it, out of Google, goggles, as an app works, how Google Glass applications work, why they bought a quantum computer, all relates to machine learning. Some of which manifest as what appear like magical products for a while. Whether your first experience with Siri or your first drive in an autonomous car, it's kind of amazing, right?
Technology is magic until you get used to it.
Exactly. Is there a
It's amazing how quickly people get used to it.
Right. So is it going to be a boil the frog all the way to generalized AI, or is there some step where it's like, okay, it's the smart personal assistant. Okay, that's not really AI. Yeah, maybe. But is it the past? Is it that same exact technology?
I think it'll creep up on us, and it's amazing how quickly people get used to new capabilities. Think back 5 years ago, most people didn't use social networks like Facebook or wikis like Wikipedia or blogs. It sounds like ancient history. It was only a few years ago. And then when these things are first introduced, they don't really work that well. So we kind of dismiss, yeah, it's really cool, but it doesn't really work. And then gradually it works, and by the time it works, we say, well, that's not so cool because it's been around for
Curse of the engineer and the first mover.
So, Siri was interesting and actually worked pretty well for a new technology. So Siri and Google now are better than they were, but people still find it unsatisfactory many times. But then it'll keep working better and better.
Mm-hmm.
I think, 2029 is still my date for Samantha in the movie Her.
Is that your new personal favorite avatar?
She's pretty good.
Yeah.
But I just posted a review on Kurzweil, I did that today, of it makes no sense that she doesn't have a body, particularly since she's Scarlett Johansson. But it'll be.
That is so wrong here. I'm glad you took up the torch on that.
Well, it'll be a lot easier to provide her a body than her human level mind. First of all, a visual presence is just about feasible now. I mean, with contact lens-based displays, she could have. You can have augmented reality where she'll sit in the chair and really look like she's there. So visual presence, in addition to her virtual auditory presence.
Virtual physical presence is easier than.
Yeah. And in the review, I put a link to some patents I have issued on how to create a tactile presence for either for another person who's with you in virtual reality, who might be hundreds of miles away, or a virtual entity.
Is it a neural thread?
No, it's actually this physical transducers. You don't actually see them, but they allow you to sort of feel another person or object. That's almost feasible today. Certainly before 2029, and Samantha's got the 2029 technology, we can have very convincing physical and visual virtual reality. So that, I mean, it needed to create some drama, and usually if you have a romantic couple, the drama comes from the differences they have. So they have a difference that he has a body and she doesn't. They try to work around that, but
It's a small obstacle.
there's another unrealistic thing at the end, but it's a spoiler, so I won't say it.
Yeah, we all should obviously go see this movie. So I want to ask one more AI question before shifting gears to one of your other passions. And maybe it's an interesting place to end. As I've thought about AI, I've always assumed it would be evolved in some sense of the word, either through an iterative algorithm that looks like a machine learning approach or a neural network. And much of what you said sounds like that, but then when you mentioned it could read its own manual and maybe make adjustments, it to me sounds like a re-entering code, or the notion that the artifact, the AI, understands its inner workings. Just as if, like, would a human understand how a brain works, or embryology, or these things that we're spending a lot of time to understand. And so my question has to do with...
We're perfectly capable of doing that. I
I
describe a thesis in my book, and maybe it's not perfect, but I mean, when we actually do have the perfect description, it's not that complicated. And we certainly can understand it. Now, we don't have easy access to our source code because our brains were not designed to be easily reprogrammed. We can do certain things with biotech and ultimately nanotech, but I mean, it's the nature of software that it's self-modified.
Do you think the inscrutability of the brain is because it's hard to reprogram? Is that what you're saying?
We have no easy access to the information. I mean, we can't back up our brains easily. I mean, we will. I think that's a late 2040s scenario, but there's no. The data is not accessible. Now, it is data. That's not a metaphor. I mean, there's information in our brain that describes our skills, our personality, our memories, and it's not backed up. I would think it's pretty amazing that we went through the day without backing up our mind file.
I'm sorry. Great. So I'm not sure if you're referring to exactly. That's all of that. So if you have re-entry code or self-modifying code or self-improving code, you can have what some AI features call hard takeoff, which means once the AI is smart enough to do a better job than we are at improving itself, it's like...
Well, even though I'm considered optimistic in terms of feasibility and progress, I'm with the soft takeoff school. Because just because it's a computer doesn't mean it's going to do it instantly. Right. And I mean, as humans,
that was my line of question.
I mean, we're doubling the amount of knowledge every year, and that's not just information. Knowledge means information that has value, like music and literature and science and technology. But that's hard to do. I mean, all of you here who are involved with startups that trying to create some new technology, it's not trivial. It's a lot of struggle. And just because an intelligence is going to be machine intelligence doesn't mean it's going to be any easier. And we're constantly going after new frontiers, and it's going to continue to be a struggle. It's going to get faster and faster, but it's not instantaneous. Right. Now, it's exponential. And exponentials, don't suddenly have a hard takeoff to infinity. Nonetheless, they're formidable. You kind of start out 1, 2, 4, 8. It doesn't sound that different than the linear progression, which is our intuition, 1, 2, 3, 4. But by step 30, you're at a billion, and at step 40, you're at a trillion. So ultimately, exponentials are quite profound.
So do you think this is humanity's ultimate leap of faith to go down this path that's qualitatively unlike any other technology in the inability to control, in any normative sense of control, where it goes? If you think about it like a safety net or a check and balance, you think about a potential thing that could go wrong on almost any other technology, you can imagine building in safeguards, building in precautionary.
Well, that's actually a good point. I mean, I talk about this as something like, for example, chapter 8, singularity is the deeply intertwined promise versus parallel of GNR, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, another word for AI. And there are technical strategies for biotech and nanotech. There's the Silmar guidelines for safety in biotech, and then I actually work with the Army on a rapid response system which is now in place to detect a new biological virus, sequence it. We can now do that in a day. Another example of acceleration, because HIV took 5 years. Create an RNA interference-based medication. That's actually in place. We had an interesting discussion where we said, wait a second, it could take months or even years to get through the FDA. And then they said, we're the Army, we don't have to listen to the FDA. But there is a rapid response system in place. It's not a pat solution, because as soon as it's put in place, it's obsolete and has to be reinvented, just like with, say, software virus protection. But there is a technical solution. There isn't really a technical solution to rogue AI. If there's some AI out there that's a lot smarter than you and is bent on your destruction, the best solution to that is not to get in that situation in the first place. If you can't manage that, then the next best solution is to get another AI that's even smarter than that on your side. And so actually, we need to integrate artificial intelligence into our civilization and maintain our values. So the values we have of democracy and liberty and value for life and knowledge, that doesn't sound like a technical solution, and it's not. And it also doesn't sound foolproof, but that is the best approach to maintain those values in our society, because these AIs is not a civilization apart. It's not an alien invasion of intelligence from Mars. We can take some comfort from the fact that it is well integrated. I mean, your smartphone is the best example of intelligence. You can access all of human knowledge. It does fantastic things. And it's not in the hands of a few corporations or intelligence agencies. It's in almost 2 billion hands. It'll be in 4 or 5 billion hands in a few years. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more intelligent knowledge than the President of the United States did 15 years ago. So that's actually very encouraging, how widely distributed these resources are. And we're already smarter than we used to be. We've integrated it into our lives. In fact, that's why we create machines. We couldn't reach that fruit at that higher branch 1,000 years ago, so we fashioned a tool to extend our physical reach, and we've extended our mental reach. And that's what AI is going to do. And it's not foolproof, because humans get into conflicts. And we see conflicts today where humans with their machines are in conflict with each other. And, technology is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, these prostheses of the mind become a mind one day. That's the point. Before we go to Q&A from the audience, I wanted to shift to gears, and maybe your mention of viruses is a segue, just to show the diversity of his interests. I'm not sure which one was the one you pitched to Larry first, but he also had this idea, as he always has many ideas simultaneously, of what is now known as Calico, which Ray came up with pretty much. And so tell us a bit about that, how that can be, or if you'd rather, how do we become immortal? I mean,
it was actually the same day, July 25th, 2012, I talked to Larry about AI, which is why I'm at Google now, and I talked to Bill Maris about, gee, why don't we start a company to overcome death? And Google's into these
big, audacious goals.
Well, Google's into that. They take on these 10x challenges, these moonshot ventures. I mean, when they decided to do self-driving cars, people said, well, it's a worthwhile thing to work on. You probably will learn some interesting things from that research, but of course that'll never work. But it does work. They've gone 500,000 miles now with no incidents, a much better record than human drivers.
I've been on them 3 times, I love it.
Which is not saying much, but
Human drivers paying attention that don't have ADD or a phone.
So the idea here is we have software running in our bodies. Biology is based on software. We have 23,000 software programs called genes, and that's not a metaphor. They are streams of data. They evolved thousands of years ago, and for example, it was not in the interest of the human species for us to live that long because there's limited food and other resources, and once you raised your kids and you were maybe 25, biological evolution didn't want you around anymore. And lots of things were different back then. So how long do you go without updating the software on your phone? It's probably updating itself right now, but we're still walking around with this outdated software. We have the means now of reprogramming it. The genome project itself is purely exponential. I mean, halfway through the project, 1% has been done. Mainstream critics, including some Nobel Prize winners, said, I told you this wasn't going to work.
Is that sequencing at this point? Or?
Yeah, sequencing. So, 7 years, 1%, it's going to take 700 years, just like we said. That was linear thinking. My reaction was, oh, we finished 1%, we're almost done, because 1% is only 7 doublings from 100%, and indeed it continued to double and was finished 7 years later. That was the enabling factor for biotechnology. We now have the means of actually, first of all, modeling and understanding these genes, which are making exponential gains on, and changing them. RNA interference can turn off genes, new forms of gene therapy can add genes. If we have more time, I can give you many examples of that. They're beginning to enter clinical practice. These technologies are now 1,000 times more powerful than they were in 2003 when the Genome Project was completed. That's the implication of doubling in power every year. They'll be another 1,000 times more powerful in 10 years, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years. Somewhere between there, 10 and 20 years, you will see a radical transformation of health and medicine based on completely different methodology. The methodology used to be hit or miss. Oh, here's something low blood pressure. We don't really know why this works. We now can actually model this software and reprogram it, and then run the reprogramming on biological simulators. So, just like the Genome Project, halfway through a project, you hardly notice what's happening. You get 1%, but then it begins to take off. We're kind of at that inflection point. We'll reach, I believe, a tipping point in longevity 10 to 15 years from now, where we're adding more time from this kind of progress than is going by.
So you're on the winning curve at that point.
Yeah.
So maybe just give, and then we'll go just to get your questions ready. We'll switch to group Q&A in a sec. But just to give you one tangible example, maybe you can share the plan you have to finish the evolution of the mitochondrial DNA transport. That was so fascinating. I don't know if there's a way to explain it without too much.
Yeah, no. I mean, aging is not one thing. There's, I'll read a great count, 7 things. I count about 12. But, so one example is we have genes both in the nucleus and the mitochondria. The mitochondria is actually an ancient bacterium that the cells that gave rise to humans kind of consumed and overtook. And those little organelles, which used to be bacteria, are still there. And they have their own DNA. They reproduce differently. Most of our genes are in the nucleus, and they use double-stranded DNA, meaning there's 2 strands. And so if there's a genetic error from the cells reproducing, there'll be probably a correct copy on the duplicate strand. So there's error correction, because there's redundancy. And it actually uses a sophisticated form of error correction from that duplication. The mitochondrial DNA uses single-stranded DNA. There's no backup copy. Therefore, it has a much higher rate of genetic mutations. So a way to fix that is to take these genes from the mitochondria, where they have a high rate of mutation, and copy them into the nucleus. So if they get damaged in the mitochondria, you'll have a good copy in the nucleus. So biological evolution noticed this and said, let's copy these genes into the nucleus. And it started to do that through biological evolution. And it finished the job. It got every gene copied from the mitochondria to the nucleus, except the 13. And those 13 kind of hit us later in life. They play a role in cancer and other diseases of aging, which biological evolution didn't select for. Well, we can finish that job because we now know how to put new genes in the nucleus using gene therapy. I'm working on a project with a company where we take cells out of the body, lung cells, non-invasively scrape them from the throat, in patients who are missing a gene that causes a terminal disease called pulmonary hypertension. So we take the cells out, add the gene in vitro, inspect it got done correctly, replicate it a few millionfold. We now have millions of cells with the patient's DNA, but with the gene that they need, and then inject it back in the body recognizes them as lung cells, and this has actually cured this fatal disease in human trials. So we know how to add genes, so we can add these 13 mitochondrial genes that have not been copied into the nucleus by biological evolution. So that we actually know how to do that. Nobody's gotten around to actually doing it because we're still working it. Well, FDA is an issue, but we have a strategy, and I can provide a strategy for each of the aging processes.
Which is pretty amazing. For those who aren't in healthcare, everything in our system, it's easy to take pot shots at the FDA, is around point solutions for what may ultimately just be symptoms of the same set of very small number of just aging or inflammation or parasympathetic response gone awry. Where if you would just look at it from that different framework, like Calico and a few others are, you come up with a whole suite of solutions that's just radically re-engineers.
We could talk for hours, or in fact,
less.
So on the different, very exciting things that are happening in terms, but they fall under this rubric of reprogramming biology.
Why don't we go to the audience? Formula one. Are we doing mics or just people speak loudly? Okay.
I have one.
Great. Let's go with Flourish right next to you.
Thank you very much. I'd love to ask this question. I read The Singularity, and I think one of the, if there's the three most important questions to humanity, whatever your other two are, one of them's got to be either will there be a technological singularity, if you're one of the people who's not sure if there will be or not, or when will there be?
Sorry, I missed a few words.
Either will there be a technological singularity, or when will there be a singularity? So I think that's one of the three most important questions for humanity out there right now.
Did you say technological singularity?
Yeah, well, humanity, your singularity.
Okay.
So my question would be, why are we the first? Why isn't there evidence of this already having happened somewhere in this huge cosmos? So, for example, sort of a Fermi's paradox type of question. Surely there will be some evidence that had reached us by now, or are we literally the first? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. There's 100 different answers one could give. But...
Well, I have an analysis of the Drake formula, which is in the end of chapter 6 in Singularities Near. And it's a formula for estimating the likelihood of a technological civilization capable of radio communication and computers and so on. And you can, so most SETI enthusiasts who analyze this come up with somewhere between 1,000 and 1 million such civilizations in each galaxy. But they then kind of use their linear intuition and assume they could be 1 million years ahead of us, and maybe their Facebook sites would be a little more interesting. And they're not really taking into consideration the exponential growth. I mean, we've gone from the Pony Express to where we are today in 150 years as the fastest way you can send information. And at least if you buy into my thesis, another half century will be multiplying our intelligence 1 billion-fold, and a century from now we'll be doing solar system-wide engineering, and 150 years galaxy-wide engineering. So if there are in fact 1,000 to 1 million such civilizations, they'll be spread out over cosmological time, which is billions of years. So they're not going to be like 11 years ahead of us. I mean, they're going to be millions of years ahead of us, and even millions is only a tiny fraction, logarithmically speaking, of the billions of years that the galaxy has been around. So how is it? So half of them would be ahead of us, and they're going to be ahead of us by thousands and millions of years, where they would be doing galaxy-wide engineering. So there should be thousands, according to this analysis, doing galaxy-wide engineering in our galaxy. How is it that we haven't noticed them? So somebody has to be first. I make the argument that they probably don't exist within our light sphere. That's not an absolute argument. I mean, there could be one other one, and they happen to be behind us. But it does the general SETI assumption, the assumption behind the SETI project, I think is flawed, which is not to say we shouldn't do the project, because even the negative finding is very important.
But would they be energy emitting, or would the most efficient thing for the Dyson sphere be just go dark and be one of these lobes that...
Well, I talk about these analyses, and maybe, civilization has adopted the Star Trek ethical guideline to not interfere with primitive civilizations like us. Or maybe they destroyed themselves. And if there were like 2 of them, or 3 of them, you could say, well, maybe one destroyed itself and one has taken the Star Trek ethical guideline. But if there's like 50,000 of them, it's hard to imagine every single one has had that kind of outcome.
But why would they give up energy?
Well, just in the course of the communication for their day-to-day work. I mean, we're putting out I Love Lucy television shows and doing all kinds of things just in the course of maintaining our civilization.
Very low power, but then I guess the Sagittarius no energy.
Well, no, I mean, those transmissions are out there and they can be picked up. So anyway, I think they're probably not out there, so somebody's got to be first. That might seem very unlikely, but in fact, the standard model of physics has all of these parameters in exactly the right range for there to be an information evolving universe. It's extremely unlikely also, but by the entropic principle, if it weren't the case, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So that's the...
In this universe, at least, we're here.
That's the gist of my argument.
Do you want to send another hand?
Yep, we have one here.
Oh, cool.
Hey, so when we talk about the concept of becoming immortal, we tend to think of it from like a biological perspective, but what are your thoughts on things like prosthetics, like heart implants that like pump your heart for you?
Well, I have a whole description of that, how it, in fact, would be quite straightforward to replace every organ. I mean, lots of our organs actually just either putting materials into the bloodstream or remove it. And that certainly can be done much more effectively by nanobots and other non-biological organs that could constantly monitor a bloodstream, remove toxins, put in the right hormones and so on. And that takes care of lots of organs. So I talk, it's true of lungs also. So I talk about how that can take place. Most importantly, I mean, the 2030s, well, to back up, another exponential trend is the shrinking of technology. We're miniaturizing technology at a rate of 103 volume per decade. When I was a student at MIT, the computer took up a whole floor of a building. Now, computers thousands of times more powerful. It's on my belt. We'll have computerized devices with wireless communication that are blood cell size in the 2030s. They're already pea-sized. Parkinson's patient puts a pea-sized device in their body connected into their brain, can actually interact wirelessly. You can download new software to that computerized implant connected to your brain from outside the patient. Requires minimally invasive surgery today, but we'll be able to do this non-invasively in the 2030s. And that'll provide 2 capabilities. One is we'll augment the immune system, which our immune system today uses tiny blood cell-sized devices, which are biological, T cells, and they're intelligent. And they're great. We wouldn't last long without them, but they're limited. It doesn't recognize cancer, for example. It thinks, hey, that's me. It doesn't deal with retroviruses. So we can finish the job and basically wipe out all disease with an augmented immune system. I used to call it the killer app for nanotechnology, but that was a good name for health technology. And they'll go inside the brain and put our brain on, our neocortex on the cloud, connect it wirelessly to the cloud. Now today, if you need 10,000 computers for 2 seconds to do a complex search, you can access that in the cloud. Not directly from your brain yet, you've got to use this intermediary, but still you can access thousands of computers as you need them in the cloud. So in the future, well, right now we have 300 million of these little modules that recognize, learn, and process patterns and organize in a hierarchy. And that's actually, we increased that amount recently, which is to say 2 million years ago when we developed these large foreheads. If you look at other primates, they have slanted brows that are not the frontal cortex. But as I mentioned earlier, the frontal cortex is not actually qualitatively different. It's running the same algorithm, but it's an additional quantity of neocortex. But that additional quantity was the enabling factor for us to take this qualitative leap and invent language in art and science, technology, something no other species had done. So we're going to do that again. Basically, nanobots in the brain will connect these neocortical modules to the cloud. So somebody's approaching, and I want to say something clever, and I've got 2 seconds to do it, and my 300 million modules is not going to be sufficient. So I'll be able to access an additional quantity, 1 billion or 10 billion, and think of something really clever to say in the 2 seconds I have. Just the way today you can access thousands of computers.
Pretty dear. Just get you right through.
So, and if you remember what happened last time, we augmented our neocortex by developing these large foreheads. That additional quantity was the enabling factor for a qualitative leap. And imagine asking a pre-language humanoid, gee, this is exciting. What's it going to be like when you invent language in art and science? He or she wouldn't understand the question. Today we can understand the question, and we can answer it by analogy. We'll take another qualitative leap with this additional brain power. And that additional brain power is subject to the law of accelerating returns. It's going to grow exponentially. Our biological thinking will be fixed. So ultimately, most of our thinking will be non-biological, and it can be backed up. And so I think that addresses your question too, in that we're not actually replacing the brain, because, well, I don't want to replace my brain. I mean, we'll stay biological, but we'll augment it. But that augmentation ultimately will be both transformative and will profoundly change who we are.
So Ray, on that point, I want to get your take on something I'm thinking about, which is another form of immortality, if you will, not so much in the physical domain, but in the digital data side. I would argue that once you can sufficiently model or encode my personality, preferences, experiences in the data domain, that is a form of immortality in the network, if you will. There could be another kind of Turing test where if to another human being, a system can simulate my personality, language, preferences, thoughts, all those things. For all intents and purposes, that is me digitally, regardless of what happens in the meat space me. So I'm wondering, would that possibly occur even faster, this modeling of personas, preferences, etc., faster than even the biological hacking side?
Well, it's a good question, and there's a couple of different approaches to that. In the movie Transcendent Man, one of the key themes is that I've kept all of these artifacts about my father. I mean, he was a pack rat, and I have all of his letters to my mother, all of his letters, and all of his electric bills, and his music, because he was a musician, and all kinds of stuff. And we would have access to his DNA, his gravesite. That's not sufficient information, but it's another form of information. So AIs in the future can take all this information and create an avatar by father that would have at least a personality and musical skill and so on that matched all this information. And he probably would pass a Frederick Kurzweil Turing test, which is to say he'd be indistinguishable from the real Frederick Kurzweil to the people who knew him. Now that's actually getting to be an easier and easier test because our memories of him are fading. But that's one approach. Now you could argue, well, that's not really Frederick Kurzweil. He'd actually be more similar to my father than my father would have been had he lived. He'd be 100 today. But anyway, you can argue about that philosophically. Another approach is to actually access the information in our biological brains. It's not a metaphor, as I said. There is information there, and ultimately it will be accessible. I think that's more like a late 2040s scenario. But if you can access it, then you can download it. Now, a third approach is, as I mentioned, we're going to start augmenting our brains with non-biological intelligence. That's going to just expand exponentially, because that's the nature of information technology. So ultimately, that will be most of our minds. In fact, it will ultimately be so powerful that it will be capable of modeling and understanding the biological part, so you can back that up too. So that's a third approach.
Ray, I have a tricky question maybe. So you're working on, the two projects you're working on, the big projects are immortality and AI, and I think both of them have as a potential side effect that they wipe out humanity. So I think we're getting a little lost, like all of us are.
A couple of words. Say that again?
I think both projects, immortality and AI, they have as a potential side effect that they wipe out humanity. So if AI goes wrong, it's pretty clear that this is a problem because it's pretty smart by definition. And immortality obviously poses a lot of problems. If you imagine, oh, there's a pill today that gives you and Steve maybe immortality, then it spreads pretty fast, the knowledge, and then we have a overpopulation problem and all kinds of follow-up problems. So I think there are answers to these problems, but these answers lie in a field that is very poorly understood. Like we are talking about wisdom technologies, moral technologies, and you say we just inject values into the AI, but we don't even understand values. Like we have to develop technologies that you can inject into the AI to become...
Well, let me address these two issues. I mean, first of all, I don't think overpopulation is an issue, for energy needs. And in fact, solar energy is growing exponentially. It's doubling every 2 years. It has been for 30 years. It's now up to about 2%. So people tend to dismiss it, 2%. It's a nice thing to do, but it's a fringe player, that's not an answer. Ignoring the exponential growth, just as they ignored the exponential growth when the general project was at 1%, or the internet was at 1%. We are only 6 doublings in 2 years each from solar meeting all of our energy needs. And so this was actually an energy study that we did in detail, showing how we would actually do that, and continue to do it, that Larry Page and I did just before he got his new job. It was for the National Academy of Engineering. It was adopted, I presented it to the Prime Minister of Israel. He was actually in my class at the Salon school in the 1970s. And he said, Ray, do we have enough sunlight to do this with, to double? At that time it was 7 more times. And I said, yes, after we double 7 more times, we'll be using 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight. We could put efficient solar farms in 1% of the unused deserts in the world to meet all of our energy needs. And that's just an existence proof. There are other technologies that also can do this. Larry was fond of geothermal. You go a mile or two that way, and it's thousands of times more energy than you need. Same with water. We have thousands of tons more water than we need. Just most of it is salinated or polluted. But there are new emerging technologies like the Cambridge slingshot system, which is decentralized. All of these things are decentralized, so they're relatively stable and not subject to catastrophic breakdown like drilling wells in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Steve mentioned vertical agriculture. That's a coming revolution where we can grow food using AI in vertical buildings rather than using up 1/3 of all usable land, using horizontal agriculture. Recycle all the materials and nutrients, so there's no environmental effect, unlike the ecological disaster of factory farming. Hydroponic plants for fruits and vegetables, in vitro cloned meat. PETA, the Animals Rights Group, is not against people eating meat so long as it doesn't come from animals. And it's also to be given very positive health profiles. So it's a complicated discussion, but we're awash in every kind of resource. And furthermore, what we see as countries get more prosperous, for example, all of Asia, the poverty rates were cut by 90% according to the World Bank over the last 20 years, as they have gone from primitive agrarian economies to thriving information economies. The population growth goes negative. Now, it will grow somewhat positive again as we cut the death rate, but the doubling time is still going to be very slow, maybe 20 years, whereas the doubling time for these technologies is 1 year or less. So it's just, people look at one trend, like, oh, we're going to cut the death rate, therefore the population is going to grow, as if nothing else in the world is going to change. And it's true of a lot of science futures and movies. They take one change on the world that's otherwise unchanged. The other challenge you posed is that AI could become rogue. We've certainly seen lots of dystopian science futures and movies about that. I take comfort from the fact that it's in fact not as I said, alien invasion from Mars. AI today is very deeply integrated and getting more and more intimately integrated. I mean, now we carry them on our belts and in our pockets, and now slipping on our eyes and into our ears, and some have slipped into our bodies. And there's a 50% deflation rate in information technology. That's one implication of the law of accelerating returns. So only the wealthy can afford these technologies at an early point where they don't actually work. Like mobile phones 20 years ago. Now that they actually work well, and according to the Apple and Android ads, do a million different things, they're in billions of hands. And I think that's, so it's not just a future prediction. If we look at the trajectory, I think it'll be very widely distributed. Now that doesn't guarantee that there's no problems, but there's actually another exponential, which is an inverse exponential of violence, due, I believe, to both greater prosperity and better communication between people. Steven Pinker's recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, talks about an inverse exponential of violence. Your chance of being killed today, either interpersonal violence or state-sponsored violence, is 500 times less than it was a few centuries ago. You might say, what are you talking about? Don't you, pay attention to the news? Well, that's another trend. We have much better information about what's wrong with the world. So if there's a battle in Damascus or Fallujah, we're not only there, we are in the midst of it. 100 years ago, there could be a battle in the next village, you wouldn't hear about it. If you read Thomas Hobbes or Charles Dickens about how difficult life was a few centuries ago, Hobbes describes it as short, brutish, disaster-prone, poverty-filled, disease-filled. Life expectancy in 1800 was 37. These technologies are, in fact, widely distributed. I wrote in the 1980s that the Soviet Union would be swept away by the then emerging social network of email over teletype machines and fax machines, and people thought that was absurd. This mighty nuclear superpower that's going to get swept away by a few teletype machines, but that's exactly what happened in that 1991 coup against Gorbachev when communism was swept away, the Soviet Union was swept away by a few hackers with teletype machines and destroyed the monopoly of information that the authorities maintained by just grabbing the central radio and TV station.
So we have another one here. David?
Well, first of all, please forgive me for this question, but it is actually kind of serious. It is related to the last question, I think, which is there any relationship between artificial intelligence and the development, or at least definition, of artificial stupidity?
Well, I mean, humans are capable of decisions that are sometimes stupid. I think we see both poles of human thinking amplified on the web, and there's actually some controversy. Are we creating the wisdom of crowds, or are we creating the wisdom of lynch mobs? We certainly see evidence of both. We see a lot of bullying online and so on, and that's not very wise. I would maintain, though, that the wisdom of crowds is winning out, and that we have a very fine-grained democracy now. One might think that, Facebook and Google are very powerful companies, but much more powerful are their users, on which they're dependent. And the users are actually very wise and smart. For example, Facebook put out some new privacy guidelines, which were a while back, and they were very complex. Most people reading them really wouldn't be able to understand the implications. However, the whole group of users, because different people understood different parts of it, they were communicating with each other, and within the day, the group of users understood the implications of that privacy policy, and they didn't like it. And within days, they forced Facebook to change those policies, and these companies have to be responsive because users can easily go to an alternative. So that really represents a very fine-grained and wise democracy. I do think these technologies amplify our wisdom more than our stupidity. But AI is going to be based on human intelligence, and it's going to amplify intelligence, with all of the problems attendant thereof.
I have one here.
So my question is basically like,
Where are you?
right here. So if the singularity is going to happen at some point, and it's going to totally transform the way that we live our lives and the way that we think about the universe and technology and everything. Why should we do anything until that point? Like, what's my personal like
a slacker
incentive to contribute? Or like, why do you work so hard at Google? Like, why don't you just hang out in a hammock somewhere in like the Bahamas and just wait for it to happen? It'll be awesome.
That's a really good question. That question comes up because I've studied these technology trends, and you look at, for example, price performance of computing is one example of the law of accelerating returns. It was actually the first one I discovered. Calculations per second per constant dollar. It goes back to the 1890 census. It's not just Moore's law, because in fact when they discovered this in 1981, Moore's law had been underway for like 5 or 6 years. It's the fifth paradigm, not the first. But it's a very inexorable curve that goes through thick and thin and war and peace and boom times and recessions, including the Great Depression. So people say, why are we working so hard? Why don't we just sit back and let it happen? And if we all actually took that attitude, then it wouldn't happen. So in fact, what is very predictable is human passion to make exponential gains and to create new knowledge, to have a passion for that. And as the tools get more and more available, more and more people can participate in that. It's one of the things driving it. That is part of our human passion. And that is what's driving it forward. And we would not make this progress otherwise. But I think we can, in fact, be very confident that will continue. Freud said the two poles of human life, the two things that make it worthwhile are work and love. Work is what I'm talking about, and love is another passion we have, connecting with fellow humans. And bots. Yeah, and some animals too.
Maybe we should. Now we're getting very interesting. Okay. Do we have time for another question?
Pull up their dogs.
Oh, that's right.
Shall we do 2 more?
Sure.
So Watson is learning from Wikipedia. Google has this incredible advantage of human corpus, search corpus, and so we can learn from that. Yet, when you look at Siri, Siri is really struggling with temporal and spatial context. If you ask Siri, show me a pizza nearby, show me a pizza far away, it has no concept. Do you think the cognitive computing space...
Is that right? Siri won't tell you a pizza place?
No, it has no temporal or spatial context today. So is Google Now.
Try Google Now?
Yes, same thing. So my question is...
Google Now knows where you are. I've asked it.
It probably knows your geolocation, but it doesn't know... It can actually very easily find spatial and temporal context, but it cannot respond back with the answer to that.
Yeah, well actually it is a hard problem to know where the user is. It can from GPS get a latitude and longitude, but to know that you're in the Starbucks or in this JCPenney store, but that there is a major initiative to actually know that. So that.
How far away do you think is the cognitive computing space from, I know there's a lot of work going on in neuroscience, but I'm wondering about character development, I'm wondering about personality. These are the things that make humans very unique, very different. How far or how much work is going on around that?
Well, you asked 2 different questions. I mean, knowing where you are is a lot simpler than understanding the personality of the user. Now, systems try to understand that a little bit now, so when they're giving you, for example, product recommendations, like you should see this movie, or you'd like to, or giving you musical recommendations, it does want to know something about you, and it bases it on what it's seen you do, like what other movies you've seen and what songs you listen to, and that can actually be pretty powerful. It's going to be, there's a lot of complicated issues of privacy and opting in and how much information you want your search engine to know. But ultimately, people actually do want to be guided. You want your search engine to understand what hot questions you have. I envision you'll walk down the street and up will pop on Google Glass version 3. You expressed concern 3 weeks ago that you were worried that your glutathione supplement isn't getting past the blood-brain barrier. Well, this new research just came out 13 seconds ago that provides a whole new approach to that. Let me summarize it for you. But then it has to actually know, not just generally you're interested in health or supplements, but really know what your concerns are. And to the extent that you want to share your concerns, it'll actually be canvassing all of knowledge as you go through the day. And I envision, the majority of responses from Google will not be in reaction to a query, but based on constantly looking out for information that will help you.
So I have a Marcus.
Since we guess the last question, kind of coming back to your question on sort of machine emotions. I'm trying to picture the world that we're sort of approaching, where with humanoids and the robots and human-like robots. Could you help us sort of envision that world? How would it look like? Will I have sort of robot friends? Will I hire humanoids as staff? And could you sort of help us understand how that world will look like?
I mean, in my book I talk about this hierarchy of the neocortex, which I alluded to earlier. And at the very highest level, all these high-level emotions, being funny, for example, is up there. Being ironic or expressing a loving sentiment. These are at the top level of our neocortex. And we're not quite there yet. I mean, there's actually challenges as we add each level of abstraction to the simulated neocortex. What is the plural of cortex?
Neocortex.
Cortex. So when I say I believe that computers will be at the human level, pass the Turing test by 2029, that's actually what I'm talking about. It is actually being funny and getting the joke and understanding irony. Because if it's just kind of doing logical thinking, computers are better than us already at that. So it is exactly being funny and so on. And as I said before, I think we're going to use these technologies to enhance our own capabilities. So we will be funnier, and sexier, and more loving. I mean, that's at least the positive side of the equation. And yes, there'll also be some autonomous AIs. How many people saw the movie Her? Spike Jonze based it on Singularity is Near, and it is, I think it's an interesting movie that it presents the idea that human level intelligence implies that you have an entity that you could fall in love with, because that's kind of the ultimate thing we do with other humans. In the same way that Matrix presented the idea that virtual reality can be as real reality. There were some unrealistic aspects of both movies. We're not going to have plugs in the back of our head, a la Matrix, and Samantha will have a body, but nonetheless, the idea that you can fall in love with an AI is an expression that we all have mastered emotional intelligence. And that's actually the threshold we're on. We need to, that's what we have not yet fully mastered.
It's an exciting world.
Can we do one more?
Sure.
Right. As you said, like general AI is going to be closer and closer to human level of intelligence. And in some domains it's going to be a million times better, and in some it's going to be worse. So like today, for example, mathematical and logical operations are much easier for the machine to process than to all the humans, even for you. But the language understanding is still at the level of a small child. And I got a question, what like functional models of the brain do you think is going to be reverse engineered the last? It's like going to be poetry or art, or as you said, like
I mean, if you watch the Jeopardy games that Watson participated in, the language is beyond a child. It's pretty impressive, sophisticated language. It includes irony and so on. I think it was a very impressive demonstration of the state of the art in language understanding. But as I said in answer to the last question, I think that the last frontier are these higher level emotional responses, and I would include humor. An interesting anecdote along those lines is this girl, human girl, this biological human girl, was having brain surgery, and she was conscious, and you can be conscious during brain surgery because there's no pain receptors in the brain. They wanted to be able to talk to her. And And whenever they stimulated a particular point in her neocortex, she would start to laugh. So they thought they had triggered some kind of laugh reflex, but they quickly discovered that no, they were triggering the perception of humor. She just found everything hilarious whenever they triggered the spot. You guys are so funny, just standing there was a typical comment. And they weren't funny. Not while doing surgery. So they had discovered a point in her neocortex that perceived humor. And that is at the top level of the neocortex. Now, by top level, I don't mean physical, because the neocortex is actually one of these modules thick, but they're organized in layers from the connections. And it's that level that we're not really yet discovered or mastered. So that is the last frontier. I mean, humor is actually very sophisticated, and there have been many doctoral dissertations on, you know, what makes something funny? Why is something funny? It's very, very subtle and complicated, and that's the final frontier.
Is that it then?
Yeah, I think.
So we're gonna keep going for 4 hours. By the way, I'm just doing my part. It's a two-part question. One is I'm Indian. I do buy one get one free all the time. So the question is one is around ethical issues. That's something that perplexes you. You think about because as I hear you talk, you know, the line between are we humans with artificial intelligence inside, or are we machines with a human sort of tactile surface, you know, gets blurred perhaps at some point. So does that, as you think about these things and as you work on them, does it bring up any sort of ethical issues in your mind?
Not per se. I mean, I think the machines are part of our human-machine civilization. We are already part machine. If we didn't have the brain extenders that we have today, we would feel only part of ourselves. There was that one-day sofa strike. I felt like part of my brain had gone on strike. Fortunately, we figured out a workaround as to how to access Google and Wikipedia. So we're already, you know, partly machine, and it's not, it's part of our human identity. I've asked Parkinson's patients, oh, that computer inside your body, connected in your brain, is that part of who you are? Because you ask questions to different people, you get different responses, but almost all of them say, it's absolutely part of who I am. And they're very jealous of it because it has restored some of their human dignity. So I think it's a very arbitrary distinction. Our biology is a set of machines. I mean, biology is a set of machines. The ribosomes and all these devices are nanotechnology that happen to evolve through evolution. They're very clever, but they're limited, and we ultimately can re-engineer it to be superior. And that is, in fact, what is uniquely human. We are the species that extends our reach and changes who we are through our tools of our own creation. So I don't think there's a distinction. I don't like the term transhumanism because it implies we're going to transcend our humanity. We're going to become transbiological, and we've been doing that. We transcend the limitations of our biology. Thing to do. Okay, well, thank you very much.
I'm sure we could stay here all night. Amazing. I have to say, we got a glimpse into the future, and I can't wait to experience it. If you want anyone to experiment to put in nanobots, my brain is yours. And this is one of the cabs from 1994 that we got from a collector. So, yeah. So enjoy this one.
Thank you.
While you're, you know, thinking about more future stuff that's going to happen. I'm sure that helps. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.